Robin Platts is the author of the recently released Times and Seasons, The Rise and Fall and Rise of the Zombies. Robin, great to meet you. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
A beautifully written book, beautifully laid out by Hozak Books, and a foreword by Susanna Hoffs. Susanna writes, quote, "The band's songs are a case study in craft and excellence, but even more importantly, the kind of songs you want to put on a mixtape or play on a boombox beneath someone's window, because they say the things you want to say and express the feelings you want to share with someone, but may not have the nerve to. Songs like You Make Me Feel Good, The Way I Feel Inside, and I Love You. Sincere, heartfelt gems delivered with unflinching, undeniable passion." That was beautifully written as well. When did you become a fan of the Zombies, and what is it that strikes you most about their music?
Well, it's funny, you spend so much time on a project like this, pestering people for details and dates from 50 or 60 years ago. And when asked that question, I can't tell you the exact year I heard the Zombies for the first time. It would have been 1976 or 77 is my best guess. I would have been 9 or 10 years old. Friends of my parents had an album called The Best of Britain. This was a K-Tel collection. It came out in the mid-70s.
Old K-Tel.
That's right. A classic, probably 20 tracks packed onto a single LP. All the British hits from the 60s were on there. And for me, this was a revelation because I knew the Beatles, I knew Simon and Garfunkel and the Animals to an extent. But this was a revelation because it was the first time I'd heard people like the Kinks, Donovan, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Dave Clark 5. But the track that intrigued me the most was something called Time of the Season by the Zombies. And it was just this incredible, ethereal, spooky, this whispery voice and curious lyrics and harmonies. And it sounded like it was from another planet. It was probably kind of a bit analogous to Rod Argent hearing Elvis for the first time. It was like, where does this come from? What is this? I didn't know anything about them apart from the name, which was intriguing in itself. The Zombies, who are these guys? But I lived with that track on a cassette tape for probably about 6 or so years. And then when I was a bit older, I got my hands on a greatest hits because I thought, well, what else did these guys do? And of course, the greatest hits was fantastic. So I absorbed that thoroughly for a couple of years. Then when I was probably about 17 or so, I had a very good friend who was enthusiastically devouring a lot of old 60s LPs, some of which I loved. Others I was a bit less taken with. Sometimes he'd play me the psychedelic type concept albums like The Ark by Chad and Jeremy. And I wasn't quite so sold on that one. And so when he mentioned to me that there was a Zombies album called Odyssey and Oracle that he just bought, I thought, oh, it's going to be like The Ark again, or, Journey to the Center of the Mind, or what, one of these kind of tripped out things. And he's like, no, you got to hear it. I'm like, okay. And I think he finally made me a cassette of it and said, here, take this, go home. And so I went home and I put it on. I thought, okay, fine. And that was my moment of revelation. Every song was just incredible. I was immediately hooked. And as good as the other stuff I'd heard had been, this album was just fantastic. So I was completely sold, and then went on to buy various other old LPs, or at the time, as we went into the late 80s, probably, there were these British labels like C for Miles and I think Castle Records that would put out Zombies compilations, and you'd end up buying one because it had like 2 tracks that I hadn't heard before that kind of sneaked out. So it kind of went like that, and on. And of course, Alec Palau put together the amazing Zombie Heaven collection eventually, which became sort of the benchmark. But that's my story.
And it's interesting to talk about that album because that, as it turns out, that's the end of the Zombies, at least for that period. Just as they're getting rolling, creatively. That's what's interesting about their story.
They'd already broken up. Yeah, they had broken up before it came out.
Right. Let's go back to the origins first. You begin with a chapter on the backstory of Rod Argent, the keyboardist, founder, and leader of the Zombies, and singer Colin Blunstone, both from Hertfordshire, England. Rod was influenced by different genres like classical jazz, rock and roll, thanks in big part to Elvis Presley. Colin, really good athlete, wanted to be a runner, but Radio Luxembourg turned him on to pop music, and then he was hooked onto Elvis and Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Ricky Nelson. So take us back to the origins of the Zombies, how they form. It's really with these two guys. It starts with them.
Essentially, in a way. I mean, Colin meeting Rod was definitely a catalyst, but really, I mean, Rod seemed like the natural place to start the story, and Rod hearing Hound Dog by Elvis, because you've got this kid who loved music from an early age, but as a kid, he only really liked classical music. He wasn't really taken by whatever popular music was going on in the 50s or early 50s and things like that. He sang in the cathedral choir at St. Albans Cathedral. Here's Bill Haley, but he's not sold on rock and roll. And then his cousin, Jim Rodford, who also features prominently in the zombie story over the decades. Jim Rodford, who's a few years older, plays him Hound Dog. And Rod says this just completely blew his world apart, as he puts it. And that phrase in itself is very Rod Argent. This is a guy who's very, very enthusiastic about music. And, I think I spoke to him a couple of different times about this Hound Dog incident. But even maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I spoke to him again. And it was as though he had just heard the record 5 minutes ago and couldn't wait to tell you about it, right? He's so, even, going into his 70s, he's so enthusiastic and so keen. And so he's absorbing all this music. He discovers Elvis, and then he gets hooked on Miles Davis, sells his Elvis record so he can buy a Miles Davis album. And as time goes by, he then sees Jim Rodford, his cousin, playing in a group called the Blue Tones, a local band. And Rod decides he's got to form a rock and roll band when he has the chance. But he's a bit too young. But time passes by, and a few years later, he's at the school music club. And he runs into a guy called Paul Atkinson, who is the same age, maybe a year younger, playing guitar in one of the school classrooms. He liked Paul's playing, he told me, but the process really of assembling the zombies is pretty informal. He just says to Paul, do you want to be in a group? Paul says yes. And so Rod meets Paul. Paul says, yeah, sure, why not? I'd like to be in a group. Rod decides they need a drummer. So where to find a drummer? Well, the school has a marching band. They have this sort of Army Corps thing that all the kids have to go in. And they have a marching band. So Rod goes and watches the marching band go by, and he picks out the guy who looks like he's got the best rhythm, which is a guy called Hugh Grundy. So again, he asks Hugh, and Hugh says, yeah, sure, why not? And then Rod has a neighbor called Paul Arnold, who's, I think, is probably his best friend at the time. Paul plays some guitar, but Rod is aware that Paul Arnold is building a bass for a school woodworking class, homemade bass guitar. So he's in. Based on that, he's going to be the bass player. Paul Arnold never played bass before at this point, but he's building one. So, that's good enough to get you in. Paul went to a different school from the others, and he sat next to a kid at school called Colin Blunstone, who played guitar. So Paul says, hey, my neighbor and friend is forming a band. Do you want to join? And so they say yes. And with that, with no real auditions or anything other than you want to be in a band, sure, okay. With that, they've got 4/5 of the lineup that made She's Not There, Odyssey and Oracle, and all the original zombie records.
Wasn't the quote, you fancy being in a band?
Yes, that was one of them, of course. Fancy being in a band.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's it. Yes.
Yeah.
Very simple. And I mean, the luck of Rod finding, like I say, 4 out of the 5 guys. Paul Arnold didn't go on with them, but yeah, the luck of finding, and these guys are going to be, number 1 or number 2 in the charts within a few years. It's just incredible the way it happens.
It is incredible. Talk about the first time they came together to practice and how that went. This was in a youth club Atkinson called a big old corrugated iron shed. And
right.
Colin had 2 black eyes and a bandage across his nose.
Yeah. So they had agreed to, I think Jim Rodford, being a bit older and being a bit more experienced and having his own band, agreed to help his cousin Rod sort of get the band together, and said, you can use our equipment and we'll set you up, but you can practice at this place called the Pioneer Club. And so they go, I think it was Rod and Jim in Jim's car, because Rod's probably not old enough to drive at this point. They stop by a pub called the Blacksmith's Arms, which now has a plaque in front of it commemorating the occasion. They pull up because they've got to pick up their guitarist, Colin Blunstone. And neither of them, I don't think, knew Colin or had met him before, but they see this tall guy outside the pub with a bandage all across his nose and his face and 2 black eyes. And I think they were slightly apprehensive about this guy. As Colin told me, he said, I think they thought I was fairly rough and tough looking. But, nevertheless, he gets in and they all troop over to the Pioneer Club. And Jim Rodford sets his own band's gear up for them. And just to sort of highlight how green they all are at this point, Hugh Grundy, although an able drummer on his side drum in the marching band, he's never played a full rock drum kit before. So Jim Rodford sets the kit up for him, and he shows him how to play a kick and snare and hi-hat, sort of a basic rock and roll type rhythm, which Hugh picks up very quickly. And at this point, Rod isn't playing anything, because the idea in Rod's mind, and again, Rod is the prime mover behind this whole thing. Rod has it in his mind that a rock band, it's 2 guitars, bass, and drums, and then Rod is going to be the singer. But at some point during that first practice, they have a break, and Rod sits down and starts playing a thing called Nut Rocker by a group called B. Bumble and the Stingers, which is it's like a rock and roll version of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. And so Colin is thinking to himself, well, why isn't this guy in the band? And then a short while after that, they're having another break or at the end of the practice or something, and Colin's strumming his guitar, and Colin just starts singing to himself, singing a Ricky Nelson song. And Rod sort of looks and thinks, well, why isn't this guy the singer? And so they kind of come to a bit of an agreement whereby Rod says, okay, I'll play piano in the band if you be the lead singer. And so that's kind of how the lineup gelled originally.
Colin had an explanation behind the black eyes and the...
Oh, yes. Just to make sure.
I'm sure people are wondering.
I don't. That's right. I
don't leave them in suspense.
That's right. I don't want to create a buildup or besmirch Colin's reputation. Colin had broken his nose playing rugby. And it was as simple as that. He was an avid sportsman. As well as being a runner, he was an avid rugby player. But rugby can be a rough game. And Colin had broken his nose. And this, to clarify, was why he was bandaged and black-eyed.
Yes, I did mention he was a good athlete. So, yes. he wasn't getting in street fights.
No, nothing, not to my knowledge. No, sir.
The band name, talk about that. A few names before they settled on the Zombies. What were those names and who came up with the Zombies? It was just it's just one of those things, somebody blurted it out.
Yeah, I think the first name they tried, because I think they got to a point where they wanted to start playing at local dances and things like that. So they had to have a name to start performing in public. And so I think they first chose the Mustangs. And then they discovered there was already another band called the Mustangs. So, okay. Then they became the Sundowners, which I think they got from a movie poster or something. And then they found out there was already another Sundowners band operating. I think they had a few other crazy ones like Chatterley and the Gamekeepers and a couple of others. But they were struggling to find a name that wasn't taken, basically. And so I think they were, as Paul Arnold explained to me, that they were all riding home on a bus after one of their practice, which again just shows you kind of how young and, sort of green they all were. They're riding the bus home after one of their practices. Paul Arnold said he just sort of blurted out the Zombies, and it stuck. They didn't necessarily already know what a zombie was, I don't think, but they knew the name wasn't taken. And I think that was the biggest selling point, and that was it. They were the Zombies.
Wow. 1964, they signed to Decca Records, and that's covered in Chapter 4. So we need to go back to an important event in Zombies history, which is the Hearts Beat competition. What was that event, and how does that lead to the band getting a major record deal?
So in early 1964, we're at the point where I think the Beatles are just about to kind of invade America, but they've already completely swamped Great Britain. Not only that, but there's a great interest in Britain and other bands from Liverpool. So they've got the Mersey Sound is sweeping the UK. People like Cilla Black, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and so on and so on. So I think by this point, the Liverpool scene has been sort of pretty much plundered in terms of finding anyone worth finding there. And there's a bit of a rush in Britain to try and find other sort of musical meccas around the UK. I think it was in January or February 1964, a journalist, Patrick Stoddart, wrote an article about Watford, the Watford Sound. Now, Watford was a town in the county of Hertfordshire. It's about 15 miles north of London and a few miles south of St. Albans, where the Zombies are from. And at this point, beat group contests were sort of a bit of a rage in the UK, battle of the bands type things, and a way to find talent and launch people. So a newspaper called the London Evening News saw this article, and they teamed up with the Watford Borough Council to launch a contest called Hearts Beat. Hearts being a play on the county of Hertfordshire. So they launched this contest called Hearts Beat, which the Zombies decide to enter, even though the Zombies, they aren't really thinking of music as a professional career at this point. They're seeing themselves mostly as a local band. But I think Rod Argent and Chris White, who's in the band by this point, were sort of thinking, well, maybe we could go pro. So they enter Heartsbeat, they win, and that's launching pad to them turning professional.
The deal that they sign, I don't think there's a better deal for a new band to sign. And that's thanks to a man named Ken Jones. Talk about Ken Jones and the lease tape deal that he suggested to the band.
Right. So when they won Heartsbeat, I think they got at least one offer right away. I think Paul Atkinson's recollection was that Dick Rowe from Decca showed up in his suit and tie and handed them a contract and told them, "You are now Decca Records artists." Didn't ask them, just told them, assuming that this would be a huge honor. But I think some of them were underage at the time. And also they weren't all desperate to become rock and roll stars. They had other options. I think 3 out of the 5 of them at least were planning to go to university. So they were able to sort of take a deep breath and step back and think about this before rushing to sign on the dotted line. Chris White had an uncle called Ted who had worked for the BBC. And so they asked Ted White and said, well, do you have any advice for us? And Ted knew a guy called Ken Jones, who was a musician, arranger, conductor. He did some film scoring and things like that, and wrote jingles as well for TV and radio ads. And he, in partnership with a guy called Joe Roncaroni, owned a company called Marquis Enterprises. It was a production company. They also had a jingle company and a few other things. So the Zombies all go around and meet Ken. At some point, either they ask or he offers, maybe I could do something for you. I could produce you, Ken explains to them. And he also suggested this lease tape deal, whereby the Zombies would record for Marquis Enterprises with Ken Jones producing them, but Marquis would retain the ownership of the recordings and they would lease them to Decca for a certain period of time. And I think it was like Decca could say yay or nay, and then they would own it. But if they said yay, they could own these recordings for a while, put them out on Decca, et cetera, et cetera. But the rights would come back to the Zombies at the end. And it was a good deal. I mean, they stayed with Marquis until I think it was actually about only a couple of years ago that they actually transferred everything over. But until that point, all their stuff still sat with Marquis. And all the way along, they told me a couple of different times that they felt like they were one of the few groups who hadn't got ripped off and still got their royalties dispersed in a fair and timely manner because of that deal. So out of all the bad things that happened to them, as Chris White told me, that was the one thing that was fortuitous, this lease tape deal with Marquis and Ken Jones.
Another great story is of the band's first single, She's Not There, number 2 on Billboard in the US, 12 in the UK. Huge hit. Rod Argent basically whips this song up in a week. Can you talk about the basis of this song? The chords are from a song by Brian Hyland and had a few different working titles.
That's right. I mean, at this point, the Zombies, when they got signed and when they did Heartsbeat, they mostly did covers. I think they did a song that Rod had written called It's All Right With Me, which they later recorded themselves, of course. But they were mostly a covers band. And their signature number was their version of Summertime, which was a big sensation when they played at Heartsbeat, the Heartsbeat contest. And so it was assumed that Summertime was going to be the first single that they did. But Ken Jones, after they'd made the deal with Ken and Marquis, Ken said, okay, you've got a session. You're going to record at Decca Records recording studios in London. He said, this was the age of the Beatles and Stones and others. A lot more bands were writing their own material than perhaps previously. And so Ken Jones says to them, well, why don't you write something for the session? Now, I think 3 of them, probably Paul and Hugh and Colin, either didn't want to or didn't think they could write something. But both Rod and Chris came up with a song. Chris wrote a song called You Make Me Feel Good, which is a really great sort of circa 64 British invasion type number. Really great. But then Rod goes away and comes up with something quite different. And again, if you go back to Rod's influences from when he's younger, in writing this song, he's sort of pulling things from all over the map, because you can hear a sort of a jazz influence. As you say, he's using sort of playing off of a chord sequence that's in Brian Hyland's Sealed with a Kiss. And if you go and listen to that record closely, you can hear shades of She's Not There in some of the chord sequences. And so Rod sort of reworks that to his own ends. There's also a big blues influence in Rod's world. He takes the first line from an old John Lee Hooker song called No One Told Me. And that becomes the starting point for the lyrics. And the song then becomes called No One Told Me, or possibly Nobody Told Me, or both. And this eventually becomes She's Not There. But he comes up with the whole thing very quickly, within about a week. I think he'd even figured out what the drum part should sound like, that sort of broken drum riff, and what the bass should be doing. And the others, I know Colin, I think, told me that they were sort of amazed when he came back with this song after just a few days.
The follow-up single, Leave Me Be, did not match the success of She's Not There. But third single, Tell Her No, they're back on the charts. Number 6 in the US, 42 in the UK. And I haven't asked about Chris White. He's so important to the Zombies. You write about him, quote, over the next couple of years, Argent and Chris White would develop quickly as writers with a constructive rivalry that would keep pushing them to greater heights. Talk about that rivalry and the contributions of Chris White.
Well, I think if it was a rivalry, I think it was definitely a friendly one. I think it was one of those cases where you have two or more writers in a band together who sort of inspire each other and push each other. You know, here's my new song. Oh, well, I'm going to write something better than that. I don't know if it was as simple as that, but definitely I think the one, you know, would inspire the other to push themselves harder. And you really see that. And in the early Zombie singles, Rod tended to write more of the singles and more of the hits. But Chris was writing some great stuff that appeared on B-sides of singles, especially I Love You, which is a fantastic song. And again, it's one of those things where you go, why didn't they make that the A side of a single? It seems incredible that that song would have been a B side, but it was. But Chris is increasingly turning out this amazing material, and even stuff that they recorded, which actually amazingly wasn't released at the time. Hits songs like I Know She Will, I think, Don't Cry for Me. I'll Call You Mine was another of his, I think, that were just fantastic. It didn't even get released until a little bit later. But it's on Odyssey and Oracle that Chris really kind of hits his stride in just a phenomenal way. He writes 7 of the 12 songs on that album are by Chris, and they're some of the best ones, just incredible songs. Beechwood Park, Brief Candles, Changes, and This Will Be Our Year, which is, that song has become sort of a standard over the years, been covered many times by many people, without really sort of becoming a hit in itself. It's sort of one of those songs that's become a standard without really becoming a hit. And so Chris, his contribution as a writer can't be overstated. It's no surprise that when Rod, after the band broke up and Rod wanted to go on and form Argent, it's not surprising that he wanted to keep working with Chris as a writer and as a co-producer.
But the band struggled to get back on the charts after Tell Her No. It wasn't until Time of the Season in 1968 they had a hit single on the charts. There were songs like Whenever You're Ready and Is This the Dream that were to put the Zombies back on the charts, but no luck. You quote Blundstone in the book. In an early 1966 BBC Radio Pop Profile interview, Blundstone said he felt the Zombies hadn't worked hard enough at promoting themselves. He said, quote, we made the hits and we didn't follow them up. Publicity, continual plugging, and really working at building up an image. People should know what you look like, what you do, and everything. And we haven't really worked hard enough at that. Do you feel that was the reason?
Not necessarily. It's an interesting thing that you mentioned that quote, because it actually made me go back and think about that a little bit further. Now, we know the band have spoken a great deal about the fact that early on in their career, they got stuck with the image of that they were the educated band, the brainy band, the group with the brain power and all that stuff, sort of this nerdy image, glasses and everything. And that they felt that hurt them in terms of image, especially if you compare them with somebody like the Stones or the Who or the Kinks, right? And also I think some of the issues they had with visas, not being able to tour America right away. And then when they did, they spent a lot of time in America and then sort of felt like they perhaps hadn't promoted themselves in the UK enough. So it's really hard to put your finger on the exact reason why. But that quote from Colin, I think, is an example of why I tried to include a number of sort of period quotes in the book, because that is something that I've never really heard any of them really sort of offer up as an opinion. The Zombies have never really struck me as slackers. These guys worked very hard. And I kind of feel like when Colin said that in 66, by that point, I think the band was starting to get pretty demoralized. And my sense is that perhaps he was just kind of trying to second guess what they'd done and trying to find a reason. Well, what's going on? Why are the Kinks always on the front cover of the Melody Maker and we aren't? Why are we getting ignored? Maybe it's something we did, maybe we didn't do enough. So that's kind of, in a way, what I think about that. But there's also a quote from the same period from Chris White, where he has a slightly different perspective. He said, because again, they're asking him about the image of the group or lack thereof. And Chris said, well, it's not really until you have hits that the image becomes a factor. He said, when you've had a bunch of hits, then people want to know about you. So his take was, you need more hits, then worry about the image. So it's a strange question. If you look at the UK music press from the time, were the Walker Brothers that much more interesting than the Zombies were Manfred Mann? And yet they're all over the papers. And the Zombies are often in a tiny little column at the bottom of a page somewhere. So were they that much more interesting? Did they have more hits? Did the other groups have better management or publicists? It's one of the great mysteries of the Zombies, as I think Colin Blunstone might say.
But with 1968's Odyssey and Oracle, the Zombies create what is considered one of the greatest albums in rock. It's ranked 100 on Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums of all time. Time of the Season would rise to number 3 on Billboard, and it's become probably the most iconic track. What was it that the band did differently on this album that made the difference? There were some changes. There was a label change. There was a producer change. The songwriting duo of Rod Argent and Chris White, they were also at the top of their game. I mean, all those things combined.
Yeah, I mean, definitely Rod and Chris were both at the peak of their powers in terms of writing. The material is just incredible. And from their perspective, they finally got a chance to produce themselves, because over the previous few years, they increasingly felt dissatisfied with the way Ken Jones was producing them. They didn't feel like he was quite capturing their sound the way they heard it or the way they were live. So with Odyssey and Oracle, they had a chance to produce themselves and to prove themselves, and they certainly did. They also had Abbey Road, or EMI Studios, better known as Abbey Road, and they had several of the same engineers who had worked with the Beatles on Sgt. Pepper and other things. And they also, I think, courtesy of the Beatles, had access to 8 tracks to record on, which was unusual at the time, at least in Britain. And I think what it really was 2 4-track machines sort of hooked up together with cables. But it essentially gave them 7 or 8 tracks to work with instead of 4. Having said that, though, they also had a very, very tight budget. I mean, Odyssey and Oracle, I think, cost something like it was either £1,000 or £2,000 to record, whereas something like Sgt. Pepper, I think, was like £50,000. But Odyssey and Oracle was a fraction of what other major albums were going for probably at the time in terms of recording costs. But even that, they managed to, I think they turned it to their advantage, because they were very well prepared in terms of rehearsal and in terms of choosing the best songs. But at the end of the day, I think they had something to prove. They'd been pretty beaten down, in terms of how their career had gone over the previous couple of years. And so they had something to prove, and they did. It just took a little while for everyone else to notice.
Robin Platts, he's the author of Times and Seasons, The Rise and Fall and Rise of the Zombies. So let's talk about Time of the Season and Rod Argent, how he came up with the song. He misheard a lyric from another song?
That's right. He wrote the song partway through, sort of, I think they were almost towards the end of the recording sessions for Odyssey and Oracle. And this went back to Smokey Robinson's Tracks of My Tears, which was a song Rod loved. But he misheard one of the lyrics in the song. There's a part of the song where Smokey sings, "If you look closer, it's easy to trace the tracks of my tears." And instead of "look closer, it's easy," Rod heard "the close of the season." And he thought, that's a good line, the close of the season. And I think at some point, Rod discovers he must have seen a lyric sheet or something and realized he'd got it wrong. But he liked this line, close of the season. So he tweaked that and turned it into time of the season. And he also, as he's writing the lyrics, he also plays off Summertime, their big fan favorite signature number from early on in their career, which has the line, "Your daddy's rich." And so Rod changes that to be, who's your daddy? Is he rich like me? In Time of the Season. And it was written fairly quickly, he told me. Again, it's fascinating that the 2 biggest hits were just knocked off quite quickly. And Rod, he told me, he said he thought this song was a hit. He thought it had some of the magic that they'd had with She's Not There. But as with Odyssey and Oracle, it took a while for the public and even his bandmates to see it that way.
Right. Colin Blunstone, he didn't think the song was all that great. And then when it came time to do his vocals, he and Rod got into a huge argument. What was that about?
Yes, they did. They got into an argument there. According to some reports, there were even some F-bombs being dropped in the studio. And Colin has been perfectly honest about the fact that he did not like the song originally when he heard it. And they were in the studio, Colin's doing his vocal, and I think Rod was offering him some advice about how he should sing the song, which in that moment Colin was not terribly receptive to. And so Colin is shouting at him, if you're so good, why don't you come in here and sing it? So they didn't like it. And Paul Atkinson as well is on the record as saying that he thought the song was a bit of an afterthought, and he thought it was one of the weaker songs on the album. But
Wow.
as we all know, it it became the breakthrough that saved them a little bit too late.
And it's such a recognizable song right from the start, too, which I wanted to ask you about the hand clap before the backbeat and the a cappella chorus. How does Argent come up with that?
Well, this is again goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about the fact that they now have 8 tracks to work with instead of 4. Rod has explained that this gave them, it was like 3 or 4 tracks more of freedom. So rather than just recording the band and the vocals, that's great. But as they're listening to the playback, Rod would sometimes hear something else. And now they had the freedom to add that extra part that Rod heard in his head. And in the case of Time of the Season, he said, what about a hand clap here? And what about a little sort of vocal kind of sound in there, right? A little sigh. Because they've got the extra tracks, they're able to easily add those on. And of course, that is a massive part of the song's sort of hook and commercial appeal.
Yeah.
You take it away, so you've still got a great song, but it's one of those little icing on the cake touches that really just pushes it that bit further. And as soon as you put the needle on the record, that comes on, and wow.
There's a story behind the misspelling of Odyssey. It's spelled Odessey. Was that intentional or a mistake? What's the real story?
Well, there's been a couple of different stories about this, one true, one less so. The cover art for the album was done by a guy called Terry Quirk, who was Rod Argent and Chris White's roommate in the period leading up to and during Odyssey and Oracle. And Terry was an artist, and he had, among other things, he had done a sort of an elaborate heaven and hell paint job on Rod's mini car, which Rod reportedly referred to as the Last Judgment on Wheels. Think of a bit like the John Lennon psychedelic Rolls Royce. So Terry had done a similar kind of a job on Rod's car, and they asked him to do the cover for Odyssey and Oracle, and he did a fantastic job with the cover art, apart from one tiny detail, which is that he spelled Odyssey wrong. When I actually first spoke with Rod, which was late 1994, he said that when this happened, that they put out this story at the time that it was actually a play on words. It was spelled ODE because it was a play on the word ode. And it was meant to have this kind of poetic meaning and blah, 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 whatever. And of course, this was the era of, bands like the Byrds with a Y and things like that. There were lots of kind of fanciful spellings in the late 60s era. So it probably seemed plausible enough, but Rod admitted at the time, he said it was just a spelling error. They were embarrassed by it, and he said it was too late to do anything about it. And I think that was the first time he had sort of actually revealed that, because just actually a few years ago, I'd read an interview with Colin from, I think, 1995 or 96, and he said, well, I didn't know anything about this until this story, the piece that I wrote in Goldmine that came out in 95. He said he wasn't aware of it till he read that article. So that was, I think I broke the misspelling story all those years ago.
The album considered a classic, but it did suffer poor sales at the time, and Time of the Season actually needed time to become the song that it's become. It was a hit in 1969, going to number 3, but by this time the band was no more. Chapter 16, titled The Rose in the Garden of Weeds. And you write, quote, in March 1968, even before Odyssey and Oracle came out and the Zombies split was announced, Rod Argent and Chris White were plotting their next move. What led to the breakup?
Well, the whole story of who wanted to break up and when was one of the things that took me a little while to sort of unravel in the book, because different people had different recollections. But what I sort of figured out in the end was that before they made Odyssey and Oracle, that Rod and Chris had sort of decided they thought the group was finished, but that they would just make this one last album, do it their own way, and just to kind of prove themselves and just to get it out of their system. Whereas the other 3, Hugh and Colin and Paul, were still, keen to go on with the group. And I think that changed over the few months they spent working on the album, whereby Rod and Chris got more and more enthusiastic because they're creating these incredible recordings. But at the same time as that's going on, the group's gigs are sort of dwindling and they're getting less gigs, perhaps slightly less prestigious gigs as time goes by. And this was less of an issue for Rod and Chris because they'd both written hit songs. Rod had written She's Not There and Tell Her No. And Chris had written I Love You, which turned out to be a hit, especially in America for a group called People. I think in 67, I think that was a hit. So they're both doing fine from their royalty monies. Meanwhile, Paul and Colin and Hugh are struggling a bit because their only real income is from whatever gigs the group is getting, and that's less and less. So that's starting to grow, a bit of tension around the money stuff. And then also they put out as a single in advance of the album, they put out Carousel 44. And I think Colin in particular has said he really thought that was going to be a hit and get them back on the charts, but it wasn't. And it's funny, if you listen to Carousel 44 now, you think, well, why wasn't that a hit?
Right.
What was wrong with DJs in Britain that they weren't playing that? Or what was wrong with CBS? Why didn't CBS plug it more? See, I'm second guessing too now.
Right.
What did somebody do wrong? That didn't happen, but it didn't. So the disappointment is growing. And in October, I think it was October 67, Paul Atkinson gets married. And I think this might have been the straw that broke the camel's back for him, because now being married, I think suddenly the lack of money and prospects becomes even more acute as a newly married man. And Paul's reached the point now where he said, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but he said I was a pretty good guitar player, but he said I wasn't Beck or Clapton, and I knew my limitations. So he's decided he's not going to make fame and fortune as a guitarist. And so at some point towards the end of 67, they're having a band practice or a meeting or something, and Paul says, I think that's it for me. And nobody really says anything. And then Rod Argent says, well, you know what, if Paul is going to leave, I think we should just fold the band. And at this point, nobody argues. There's no great pushback. I mean, it's been a decline for several years now. I think they're all fairly demoralized. Even having made these great recordings, they're very dispirited. And so they split around the end of 67. And this is about 3 months before Odyssey and Oracle came out. And I think they might still have changed their mind if Odyssey and Oracle had become a hit, or if Time of the Season had, because of course Time of the Season came out as a single in Britain, I think in April 68, around the same time as Odyssey and Oracle came out. But again, it bombed. And again, what was wrong with DJs or the music industry that wasn't a hit?
Head scratcher. Yeah.
If you go back and read some of the reviews in the music press at the time that single came out, several of the people, knowledgeable music journalists at the time in the UK, said, it's not going to be a hit. That's too complicated for the charts. This won't get played on the radio. Incredible with hindsight. But right. So that was it. They split. The album came out. I don't think CBS exactly went overboard in plugging it, perhaps because the band had already split up, but it came and went without much notice. And even before it came out, Rod was already starting to work on the seeds of what would become the group Argent.
Right, because in 1969, the last lineup of the Zombies, Rod Argent, Russ Ballard, Jim Rodford, and Bob Henrit, began working under the name Argent with Chris White as a non-performing songwriter. They had the hits, Hold Your Head Up, Tragedy, God Gave Rock and Roll to You. Meanwhile, there were fake zombies popping up. You write, quote, between September 1968 and 1970, at least 4 groups purporting to be the Zombies surfaced in Britain and America, and one included 2 members of ZZ Top. I believe it was Dusty Hill and Frank Beard, right?
Yes. Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Who was behind these bands, and how were they able to get away with this? And was any legal action taken?
There was certainly some legal action taken against them, but it seemed like it didn't necessarily work. These bands were sort of zombie-like, I think, in themselves, and that they would get shut down and then rise from the dead and yes. Show up in Mississippi or wherever, playing at some small club. And I think especially in those days, I mean, I think we forget almost how pre-internet, pre-social media and stuff, how isolated from each other we were compared to how things are today.
You're right.
And so I think it was a lot easier to get away with stuff like that. And what was interesting that in researching the book, I mean, the thing with the 2 sort of most well-known bands, which were put together by a group called Delta Promotions out of Michigan, and they had 2 fake zombie bands that they were running. One was out of Michigan, of course, which had former members of a Michigan band called the XLs, including a guitarist whose name was Terry Quirk, which was very strange. Same as the Odyssey and Oracle artist.
Yeah.
Complete coincidence as far as I can tell. And yeah, another one from Texas, the Texan Zombies with Dusty Hill and Frank Beard. But in researching the book, it's some of this stuff is very hard to document because it's so long ago, and being in a phony band is not something anyone probably really wants to put on their resume or their LinkedIn or whatever. But I did find that even, back as far as September 68 through the end of 68, there were ads for the Zombies from England playing gigs in different places in the United States, which the real Zombies most certainly were not doing, and they didn't exist. Places like Rain, Louisiana, Tulsa, Iowa City. One of my favorites is the Heeland High School Press Club dance in Sioux City.
Wow.
Prestigious gig. And it's funny because in researching the fake band stuff, I was in touch with a guy named Gary Johnson, who has a website called Michigan Rock and Roll Legends. And he knew a lot about the Delta Promotions bands, being from Michigan himself. But as I was digging around, I found an ad for one of these, just December 1968 show by one of these fake Zombies bands. And they actually had a photograph of the band in it. I had no idea who it was. And I sent it to Gary and I said, who recognize any of these guys in this photo? And he emails me back and says, well, actually, I do. He said, that's a group called the Bossmen. Oh, I wasn't familiar with the Bossmen, but the Bossmen were a Michigan band who were active in the mid-60s up till 67, I think, and whose lineup included Mark Farner, whose name I did recognize as the singer-guitarist of Grand Funk Railroad.
Wow.
So this was odd because the Bossmen had already broken up by 68. So I did actually reach out to Mark Farner, and he said he had no recollection of being in a Zombies band. But what's interesting is that Farner was in a band in late 68, early 69. He was in a band called The Pack. And The Pack were, for a time, had as their booking agent Delta Promotions, which is the same band that was handling fake zombie bands. So there's sort of this connection. I don't know if Delta just got their hands on an old photo of the Bossmen and sent it out to clubs with their fake Zombies bands, thinking, well, who's going to know or care who's in the photo, right? But very strange. And then there was another band in the UK. Another thing that I came up with that I hadn't known previously was that there was a band in Bristol, UK, called Mark Roman and the Kind spelled with a Y again, who decided to change their name to the Zombies in early 1969 for, I don't know, it was a publicity stunt, get attention. So they called themselves the Zombies and started playing gigs. And the Zombies management,
it's like a scary movie. There's zombies popping up everywhere.
Yeah. And apparently
they're coming to get you, Bob.
Yeah, they were doing okay for a while. They were quoting the lead singer of that band, saying it's great. We go out there and we start playing "She's Not There," and the crowd goes wild. But legal action, they were shut down. And I think there were probably some others. But again, it's not the kind of thing that people are going to be inclined to brag about. But this was an ongoing thing. I think cease and desist orders. There's the UK music press, and maybe in America too, there were notices published. Rolling Stone, I think, did a couple of different expose pieces in America letting people know these are, if you see an ad for the Zombies, it's not the Zombies kind of thing. So, yeah.
Wow. You go into great depth as to what the members of the band were doing, the projects that they were involved in post-Zombies. As we get into the 80s and the 90s, interest in the Zombies is growing, and fans of old, also those who weren't around to see the band, were hoping maybe a reunion's going to happen. So let's skip ahead to chapter 36, and it's titled, All Right, Just 6 Gigs Then. You lead with, quote, in 1998, despite the success of the Zombie Heaven box and renewed interest in the band, a Zombies reunion seemed as unlikely as ever. While lauding the box set, Rod Argent stuck to his guns on the subject of reviving the band, telling the Tampa Tribune that the Zombies' 60s career seemed like a perfect little circle. I wouldn't touch it now. What ultimately leads to this Zombies reunion in 2004?
Well, it's funny. And I was just, as you said that, as you were reading that, it made me think, because for myself, by 98, by this point, I had spoken and interviewed and written about the Zombies a fair amount by that point. And if you had asked me the odds of a Zombies reunion happening at that point, I would have said, it's not going to happen. Rod will never do it. Rod does not want to do it, so it's not going to happen. And Rod had always resisted this idea. Rod's always been pushing forward. And even when there was a time in 89 when Colin and Hugh and Chris got back together to make a Zombies album, which was in response to yet another fake zombie band touring America in 1988. That's a whole other story. So we'll
another one. Okay.
That's another one. Yeah. That's a whole other chapter. So they'd made that album, and Rod very reluctantly, I think, maybe appeared on one track, but he wasn't really into the idea at all. And so Rod kept doing his own thing. He had quite a bit of success as a producer in the 80s and 90s and doing his own thing, made a classical album and assorted other things. And in 98, his friend John Dankworth asked him if he would perform a benefit concert for his Stables Theatre in Milton Keynes in England. And so Rod says, great, do a show. And so Rod puts a little program together. I think some of it's Rod playing some jazz piano. There's a reunion of the group Argent for part of it. But then at the end of the show, Colin Blunstone is in the audience. And Rod invites Colin up on stage to do a couple of numbers. And they do She's Not There and Time of the Season. And both of them have said that when that happened, the chemistry just clicked once again and felt like they'd stopped working together just a few weeks earlier rather than many years. They just slotted in. And now Rod and Colin have slightly differing recollections of what happened after that. Rod's recollection is that after that happened, that he wanted to get together and start working together again as a regular thing. Colin's recollection was that Colin had a keyboard player in his group who had a tendency to not show up for gigs, and therefore he asked Rod to fill in. But whatever the case, he and Rod decided to go out and play a few gigs early in 99, and that was sort of the starting point for all of it. But it was just 6 gigs at the start, and then it sort of grew. I think they enjoyed it so much, but Rod still resisted using the Zombies name, because for the first few years they did this, they called themselves Colin Blunstone and Rod Argent, or Rod Argent and Colin Blunstone. It wasn't the Zombies, even though obviously people knew who they were and stuff like that. And then I think when they were making an album together, as far as I can see, this is in 2000, I think it was 2004, 2003. And Rod actually told me, he said he had a dream. He had a dream one night that this album they were making, that it said the Zombies on the cover. And he tells Colin, and Colin can't believe this because, he knows Rod's been vehemently opposed to this all these years. But no, Rod has a dream, and they start using the Zombies name and go on to spend the next nearly 20 years touring as the Zombies, both with a new lineup that includes Rod and Colin, and also playing some gigs that also feature Hugh Grundy and Chris White, and on one occasion with Paul Atkinson as well, right before Paul passed away. So yeah, the rest is history. And it's only really in the past year or so that they finally retired. But amazing. I mean, I saw them back in, I think it was 2007 or 2008. And I remember thinking at the time, I've got to go and see them because they're not going to keep doing this for long. But they stuck with it and had great success touring over the past 2 decades or so.
Yeah, so where are they at now? So there's no more Zombies. Does Rod Argent still perform?
My understanding is that Rod had a stroke, and I think the decision was that he didn't want to, or didn't feel like he should be touring anymore. I don't think they've ruled out making more recordings as the Zombies, because they've made records that have done quite well, been back in the Billboard charts and things in the past number of years. So I think that's still an option. I don't know that they've officially broken up. I think the door is still open for more recordings for sure.
Why do you think people still have such admiration for the Zombies in 2025?
The easy answer, I guess, is just to say that the music is great. But I think there's more to it than that in a way. And even if you go back to the mid-'60s era, after they'd stopped having hits, in the UK press, and maybe in America too, probably in America too, there was always a contingent of people rooting for them. In the UK, you had Penny Valentine, who was a journalist from the music press there, and Kenny Everett, who was a DJ. And these people would sort of champion the Zombies. And I think there's something compelling about that. I think anyone that's a real music lover will often have a particular artist or band that they love to tell people about, that people won't have heard of. And, oh, you've got to hear this. You got it. And I think the Zombies is that band for a lot of people. And I go back to when I first discovered them, the sort of origin story of how that happened. Susanna Hoffs, in the foreword to the book, talks about hearing them when she was a kid in her mom's station wagon. And yet they never quite seemed mainstream. When I first got into them, and even when I was a teenager and stuff, it always felt like you were part of this little club that knew about this band, and that you were slightly outside the mainstream, but you're also overjoyed to be able to share it with people too. So I think there's been that element too, about having this group that's sort of just outside of Beatles and Stones type of territory, but that are just fantastic. And then I think that that's only been supported by them fact that they've been touring over the past 20 years. So not only are people discovering them, and of course, with Spotify, YouTube, et cetera, that's probably just led to a whole new generation of people being able to discover them. But now, or at least over the past 20 years, they could also go and see them live. So I think that's my best guess as to what's going on.
And people can get the complete history of this band through this book, Times and Seasons, The Rise and Fall and Rise of the Zombies. It's out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. It's through Hozak Books.
I have to say, I have to give props again to Hozak, because I'd seen, as we were working on this, I'd seen a few different sort of proofs, PDF proofs on my computer as we were going through the latter stages of the process. But when I opened the box and actually got my hands on a hard copy of the book, it's nice. It looks nice. It feels nice. So kudos to Todd and the team at Hozak. It's just a nice thing to hold in your hand. So, and you, sir, have been a great host for my first podcast appearance. So hats off to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome, and thank you. Robin Platts, thanks so much.
Thanks.